"Step aside, ma'am. I need to verify your passenger seat." "I think there must be some mistake," the flight attendant said, her voice lowered but still audible. "There's no mistake, Victoria," the black woman replied evenly. "This is my assigned seat. This airline has a reputable standard of people who should be here in this seat which you do not fit in, so you have to move to another, or I call the security to get you out," the flight attendant said firmly. Soon, the commotion started. Passengers reached for their phones, capturing what would soon become one of the most expensive acts of discrimination in corporate history. A successful black woman in an impeccable suit stood her ground as two airline security officers towered over her, their faces twisted with contempt as they grabbed her arms. "Ma'am, you need to come with us now," one officer barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. They dragged her down the aisle anyway, past shocked passengers, past flight attendants, who looked everywhere but at her eyes. The security officers smirked at each other, believing this was just another day. Just another difficult passenger who didn't know her place. But on this particular day, Skybay Airlines Flight 3429 became the scene of a catastrophic miscalculation and lost the very opportunity that would have saved them from bankruptcy. All because they couldn't recognize who the black woman they were humiliating was. If you've ever witnessed injustice and wished for consequences, if you've ever wondered what it would feel like to watch karma unfold in real time, this is the story you've been waiting for. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance? Share your experience or type yes in the comments below and hit the subscribe button now. Here's how it all began. Victoria King wasn't born into wealth or privilege. At 48, she stood as a testament to what determination can build against all odds. As the founder and CEO of Global Transit Solutions, she controlled the largest travel logistics empire on the planet, a company that decided how and where Fortune 500 executives and their teams travel globally. Her signature on a contract could make or break an airline. That morning, in her Manhattan penthouse, Victoria reviewed the final details of what would be the largest contract her company had ever awarded. $5.2 billion, having 8 years of exclusive corporate travel bookings for Skybay Airlines. A lifeline that would rescue the struggling airline from near-certain bankruptcy. That morning, Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from James Chen, her chief operating officer, saying, the board had approved the contract terms and legal had finalized all documents. James Chen was the major face of her company, always serving as her representative to the public, and this made most people unaware of who she really was. She responded with characteristic precision. "Good. Atlanta meeting set for 3 p.m. We'll sign unless any issues arise. Keep Continental and Meridian Airline on standby as contingencies." Victoria always had a backup plan. In 15 years as CEO, she'd learned that lesson many times over. At 10:30 a.m., her driver pulled up to Terminal 5. Victoria stepped out, her tailored Armani suit and confident stride turning a few heads. She'd chosen to dress minimally and fly commercial today, rather than take the company jet. She believed in experiencing the service standards of potential partners firsthand. Today's Skybay Airlines flight would be the final test before committing her company's business. At the first-class check-in counter, Victoria placed her passport and premium boarding pass on the counter. The attendant barely glanced up, her gaze lingering on Victoria's face a beat too long before looking back at the computer. "Are you sure you're at the right counter, ma'am?" the attendant asked, emphasizing this counter, with unmistakable doubt despite Victoria's executive demeanor. Victoria maintained her composure, calmly presenting her passport and first-class boarding pass. The attendant examined them with unusual scrutiny, turning the passport over repeatedly and checking the boarding pass against her computer multiple times. "I'll need to see your ID again," the attendant said after several minutes of verification. Victoria complied, her expression neutral, as she handed over her identification for the second time. Meanwhile, she couldn't help but notice the white businessman behind her being greeted with a smile and processed through with barely a glance at his documentation. As the scrutiny continued, a third white passenger was welcomed to the first-class counter and quickly checked in while Victoria remained waiting. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" Victoria finally asked, her tone professional but firm. "Just following protocol," came the rehearsed response as the attendant picked up a phone, calling for a supervisor without making eye contact. Victoria discreetly took out her phone and typed a message to her executive team. "Flag on Skybay Airlines." The supervisor arrived promptly, taking Victoria's documents and beginning the verification process anew, as if the previous 20 minutes of examination had never happened. "Miss King, could you verify your destination today?" the supervisor asked, despite the information clearly printed on the boarding pass in her hand. "Atlanta," Victoria replied simply. "And the purpose of your travel?" Victoria noted the question, one rarely asked at check-in, especially in first class. "Business," she answered, the irony not lost on her that the business was a $5.2 billion contract that would save this very airline. After nearly 30 minutes at the counter, while other passengers continued to be processed efficiently, Victoria was finally cleared to proceed, but not before the supervisor added a small notation to her boarding pass. "What does this mark indicate?" Victoria asked. "Just a routine security designation," the supervisor replied with artificial brightness. "Nothing to be concerned about." That routine designation became immediately clear at the TSA checkpoint, where Victoria was directed to step aside for additional screening while other first-class passengers moved through the priority lane unimpeded. "We'll need to conduct an additional search," a TSA agent informed her, pulling on blue nitrile gloves. Victoria stood in silent observation as her meticulously packed belongings were removed one by one. The agent roughly handled the contract folder, creating a small tear in the corner of what happened to be the signature page of the multi-billion-dollar agreement. Her grandmother's pearl earrings were dumped carelessly onto the metal table. One pearl bounced off the edge and was stepped on by a passing agent, cracking the heirloom. "Sorry about that," the agent said without looking up or making any move to retrieve it. Victoria picked up the damaged pearl herself, pocketing it rather than returning it to the case. As she reorganized her scattered belongings, she took out her phone once more, documenting the damage with discrete photographs before sending another message to Chen. By the time Victoria reached the gate, Flight 3429 was showing a 40-minute delay. When boarding finally began, she waited with other first-class passengers, mostly white businessmen exchanging casual conversation about golf handicaps and market fluctuations. No one acknowledged Victoria's presence. As she approached the gate agent, Victoria presented her boarding pass. The agent scanned it, then paused, looking from the screen to Victoria's face with poorly concealed surprise. "First class is boarding now," Victoria said gently. "Yes, I see that," the agent replied, her tone suggesting she saw something else entirely. She scanned the pass again before reluctantly letting Victoria board. At the aircraft door, the flight attendant's practiced smile faltered when Victoria approached. "Welcome aboard," she said, her eyes dropping to Victoria's boarding pass. "Oh, first class is to your left." The note of surprise was unmistakable. The first-class cabin was half empty as Victoria found her assigned window seat, 2A. As she settled in, the white man in his 60s already seated in 2B glanced up with undisguised annoyance, shifting to create more distance between them despite the generous proportions of first-class seating. Soon, a different flight attendant approached. "Excuse me." Victoria looked up. "Yes?" "I need to check your boarding pass, please." Victoria maintained her composed expression as she retrieved the boarding pass that had already been verified multiple times. The flight attendant studied it with peculiar intensity. "I think there must be some mistake," she said finally, her voice lowered but still audible. "There's no mistake," Victoria replied evenly. "That's my assigned seat." The man beside Victoria cleared his throat theatrically. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the flight attendant, speaking as though Victoria weren't present. "I paid for a peaceful first-class experience." The flight attendant gave him a conspiratorial smile. "I'm just double-checking something, sir." "Well, I'm not sure she's in the right section," he continued. "These seats are quite expensive." Victoria turned to face him directly. "I'm well aware of the price, sir, as I am aware of the cost of this tablet, this watch, and especially the cost of my time, which is being wasted with these interruptions." The businessman blinked, momentarily taken aback. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "Your boarding pass appears to be in order, ma'am, but our system is showing some discrepancy. Would you mind if I take a quick photo of it for verification?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "In 15 years of executive travel, I've never once had a flight attendant photograph my boarding pass. Is this new Skybay Airlines policy?" "It's just to resolve the confusion." "What confusion exactly?" Victoria's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath it now. "This is the third time my documentation has been questioned. Is there a specific reason why?" The directness of the question created a palpable tension. Several nearby passengers were watching with undisguised interest. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," the flight attendant replied defensively. "As am I," Victoria said simply, returning her attention to her tablet. The flight attendant hesitated, then reluctantly retreated, boarding pass still in hand. Victoria noted that she didn't return it. Another small indignity in an increasingly troubling pattern. The businessman beside her wasn't finished. "They're just trying to maintain standards," he said condescendingly. "First class has certain expectations, and this airline is known to be more luxurious for your kind." Victoria didn't look up from her tablet. "My kind can afford even more luxurious airlines than this." His face flushed at the rebuke, but before he could respond, the flight attendant returned with the purser. "Ma'am," the purser began coolly, "my colleague has brought some concerns to my attention." Victoria looked up calmly. "What concerns specifically?" The purser seemed momentarily thrown by the direct question. "There seems to be some question about your seat assignment." "There is no question about my seat assignment," Victoria corrected gently. "Your colleagues have verified my boarding pass multiple times. I am in my assigned seat. The only question is why I am being repeatedly asked to justify my presence here." The businessman beside her chose this moment to interject again. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't think she belongs in first class. It's creating an uncomfortable atmosphere." The purser didn't correct him nor defend Victoria. Instead, she gave him an understanding nod. Victoria watched this exchange, then picked up her phone and began typing a message. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass again?" the purser asked. "No," Victoria replied calmly. "You can't. Your colleague has already taken it for reasons that remain unclear. This is now the fourth time my right to occupy this seat has been questioned. I have shown my documentation repeatedly. I will not participate further in this exercise." The cabin had grown eerily quiet. Even passengers in economy, still boarding through the aisle, had slowed to observe the confrontation. "If you cannot provide your boarding pass," the purser began. "I did provide it," Victoria corrected her. "Your colleague retained it without my permission. If you're unable to locate it within your own system or among your own staff, that is a failure of Skybay Airlines, not of my documentation." The businessman was now openly smirking. "Maybe you should just move her back to economy, where she'd be more comfortable," he suggested to the purser. Victoria turned back to the purser. "I will remain in my assigned seat. I suggest you direct your attention to the completion of the boarding process rather than to the continued harassment of a legitimate first-class passenger. The confrontation had reached an impasse. The purser reluctantly retreated, but Victoria knew this wasn't over. The looks exchanged between crew members, the whispered conversations, something was still brewing. 30 minutes into the flight, an uneasy calm had settled over the first-class cabin. The seatbelt signs were off, drinks had been served, though Victoria noticed her request for water came significantly after her seatmate received his scotch, and passengers had settled into their routines. Victoria noticed movement at the front of the cabin. The purser and flight attendant engaged in intense conversation, occasionally glancing in her direction. Recognizing the signs of trouble brewing, Victoria quietly set her tablet to record video, positioning it on her tray table at an angle that captured both her seat and the aisle beside it. 3 minutes later, the pair approached her row. "Miss King," the purser began, her voice lowered but still audible to nearby passengers, "I need to speak with you about a seating issue." Victoria looked up with polite interest. "Yes?" "Our system is showing a computer error with your seat assignment. We'll need to relocate you to economy class for the remainder of the flight." The statement hung in the air. "That's peculiar," Victoria replied, her voice measured and clear. "Especially considering my boarding pass was scanned successfully, my seat was confirmed multiple times by your staff, and I've now been sitting here for nearly 40 minutes. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, but the purser pressed on. "It's an unfortunate technical issue, but we need to resolve it immediately." "I see," Victoria said. "May I see documentation of this error?" The request caught them off guard. The purser hesitated. "It's in our internal system." "That won't be necessary. We simply need you to gather your belongings and move to seat 27C, which we've reserved for you." Victoria noted the seat assignment wasn't random. 27C was a middle seat in economy. The deliberate nature of the humiliation attempt was almost impressive in its calculated pettiness. "I understand you believe you're following protocol," Victoria said firmly. "However, my ticket is valid. My seat assignment is confirmed, and I'm not moving." The businessman beside her made a sound of disgust. "Just do what they're asking. You're making a scene." Victoria didn't acknowledge him, keeping her focus on the airline staff. "If there's a genuine documentation error, I suggest we address it after landing in Atlanta." "This isn't optional, ma'am. You need to move to economy now." If you were in Victoria's shoes, would you leave your seat to the economy seat to maintain peace, or would you claim your right seat and not leave first class? Share your thoughts in the comments, and click on the subscribe button now to enjoy more stories like this. Around them, the atmosphere had transformed. Passengers were openly watching. A woman across the aisle had her phone out, recording discreetly. 2 passengers behind Victoria were whispering to each other, their expressions concerned. Victoria remained perfectly still, her voice calm but carrying clearly. "My ticket is valid. I am in my assigned seat. I will not be moving to an economy seat." In that moment of hesitation, Victoria picked up her phone in full view of everyone and began recording the interaction herself. No attempt at subtlety. The message was clear. Whatever happened next would be documented. "Please put your phone away," the flight attendant said immediately. "Recording is not permitted." "That's incorrect," Victoria replied. "FAA regulations don't prohibit passengers from recording interactions as long as they don't interfere with crew duties or flight safety. I'm simply documenting this conversation for accuracy." The purser's face had flushed with anger. "This is becoming disruptive." "I agree," Victoria said calmly. "It became disruptive the moment you attempted to remove me from my legitimate seat based on an unsubstantiated claim of computer error. I'm simply sitting in my assigned seat, reviewing business documents, and causing no disruption whatsoever." 3 minutes passed in tense silence. Then the cabin speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor security concern that requires our attention. As a precautionary measure, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at the next international airport. This is just a precaution, and we don't anticipate any danger to the aircraft or passengers. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement sent a ripple of concerned murmurs through the cabin. Victoria felt dozens of eyes turned toward her, passengers making the connection between the recent confrontation and this sudden diversion. Victoria understood immediately what was unfolding. The security concern was her, a fabricated escalation designed to remove her from the aircraft entirely. With deliberate calmness, Victoria picked up her phone and sent a text to her executive team, informing them of the happenings. The aircraft touched down in Charlotte and taxied toward a small gate rather than a regular gate. Victoria understood they weren't planning to deplane other passengers. This stop was for her alone. Through the windows, she could see security vehicles with flashing lights approaching. The captain's voice came over the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be stopped here briefly while security addresses our situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Victoria closed her tablet and placed it in her purse along with her phone. She straightened her suit jacket and waited, perfectly composed as the aircraft door opened and footsteps sounded on the jet bridge. 2 uniformed men entered the cabin. Airport security officers with the contracted police insignia of Skybay Airlines visible on their shoulders. They spoke briefly with the purser, who pointed directly at Victoria. The officers nodded and began making their way down the aisle toward her. Victoria could feel the collective tension of the other passengers. Some were still recording discreetly. Others looked away, the human instinct to avoid witnessing humiliation overriding their curiosity. The officers stopped beside her row. "Ma'am, we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Victoria looked up with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout. "May I ask why I am being removed from this flight?" "The crew has reported a disturbance," he replied vaguely. "What disturbance specifically?" Victoria pressed, her voice clear enough to be heard by nearby passengers. The officer didn't answer directly. "We can discuss this once we're off the aircraft. Please stand up and come with us now." Victoria recognized the tactical evasion, but also understood the power dynamics at play. With deliberate dignity, she sat boldly and refused to be moved. After seeing how unreceptive Victoria was, the security grabbed her hands and dragged her down the aisle. But she maintained her composure, fully aware that every passenger was watching, many recording it on their phones. What none of them could see was that Victoria King wasn't just leaving the aircraft. She was mentally rewriting a $5.2 billion contract and calculating precisely how this morning's humiliation would transform into one of the most expensive customer service failures in aviation history. "I'd like to understand the specific reason for my removal," she said calmly as they walked her out. "I have a right to that information." "The flight crew reported your disruptive behavior as a risk to the flight," the second officer replied, falling back on the vague accusation. "That's not a specific reason," Victoria countered evenly. "What behavior precisely was deemed disruptive?" The officer's grip tightened rather than released, a telling response that revealed this was about power, not compliance. Victoria said nothing more, but catalogued the increasing use of force against her continued cooperation. As they reached the end of the jetway and entered the terminal, the second officer spoke into his radio, requesting additional assistance. The terminal gate area was crowded with travelers waiting for other flights, their heads turning at the unusual sight of a well-dressed black woman in a business suit being forcefully escorted by airport security while a group of passengers recorded the scene. The public nature of the spectacle seemed to further agitate the officers. "Just keep moving," the taller officer growled, his hand now gripping Victoria's upper arm with bruising force. "You're hurting me unnecessarily," Victoria stated, loud enough for nearby witnesses to hear, her voice still controlled but clearly documenting the excessive force. The second officer moved to her other side, and together they accelerated their pace, now practically dragging Victoria between them as they cut through the crowded terminal. Her heels barely touched the ground as they forced her forward. The indignity of the treatment at stark odds with her professional appearance and continued composure. Travelers stopped to stare, many instinctively reaching for their phones. In the digital age, scenes of perceived injustice spread like wildfire. And this image, a poised black woman in business attire being forcibly dragged through an airport terminal by two white officers, was striking in its visual discord. "What did she do?" someone in the terminal called out. "Nothing," responded one of the passengers who was recording. "They're removing her for sitting in her assigned first-class seat." The officers increased their pace, nearly lifting Victoria off her feet as they approached a side corridor leading away from the main concourse, away from witnesses, away from documentation. It was at this moment that the situation took an even darker turn. "First class in this airline is not for some people," the taller officer muttered, just loud enough for Victoria to hear. The comment wasn't meant for the witnesses or even his partner. It was intended for Victoria alone. A private moment of racist contempt slipped beneath the public confrontation. They ended at a nondescript door marked "Security Personnel Only." With a swipe of a keycard, the second officer opened it, and they began to pull Victoria through. It was in this final moment, as she was being dragged across this threshold into a non-public area, that Victoria King finally broke her silence with words that would prove prophetic. "This will be the most expensive mistake Skybay Airlines ever makes." Her voice was calm, measured, and utterly certain. Not a threat, but a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions. The taller officer snorted dismissively. "Yeah, we hear that all the time. Do you think Victoria should cancel the airline's contract for what they did to her? Or should she forgive them and still award them the contract? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button now." The door closed behind them, cutting off some witnessing passengers from direct observation. But their phones had captured everything. The unnecessary force, the racial comment, Victoria's composed warning, and the officer's dismissive response. Within minutes, those videos would begin their journey across social media platforms. The first ripples of what would soon become a tsunami. "You'll need to provide a statement explaining your disruptive behavior on the aircraft," the second officer said, placing a form on the table in front of her. His tone suggested this was a formality, that the outcome was predetermined, regardless of what she wrote. Victoria didn't touch the form. "I'd like to make a phone call first." The taller officer laughed. "This isn't jail, lady. You don't get a phone call." "Actually," Victoria replied evenly, "according to TSA regulations, passengers detained by airport security for non-criminal matters retain the right to communicate with outside parties." The precise citation of regulations they themselves likely didn't fully know caught the officers off guard. They exchanged another uncertain glance. "And what important call do you need to make so urgently?" the taller officer asked mockingly. "Important business meeting, huh?" The condescension in his tone was thick, layered with assumptions about who Victoria was and wasn't, about what she could and couldn't know or do or be. "You have no idea," she said quietly. 3 words, spoken without heat, yet containing within them the absolute certainty of someone who knew precisely what forces she could bring to bear, what consequences would follow, What reckonings were already in motion beyond the walls of this small, harsh room? 20 minutes had passed since Victoria was brought into the security room. 20 minutes of her sitting in composed silence, refusing to fill out their incident report, requesting only access to her belongings and permission to make a call. After seeing how uncooperative she was, they gave her back her things. "You can have your things back," the taller officer said, sliding her purse across the table with deliberate carelessness. His earlier confidence had begun to fray at the edges, replaced by a vague discomfort he couldn't quite name. Something about this woman wasn't following the usual pattern. She should have been emotional by now, angry, tearful, frightened, or begging to be allowed back on her flight. Instead, she'd sat in unwavering dignity, her eyes occasionally meeting his with a calm certainty that made him increasingly uneasy. Victoria reached for her purse, examining its contents with methodical care. Her passport was there. Her wallet, her tablet, thankfully unbroken despite the rough handling. And most importantly, her phone. "Your flight has already departed for Atlanta," the second officer informed her, his tone suggesting this was a victory of sorts, that she had lost something by being removed. "We can book you on a later economy flight if you cooperate with our investigation." Victoria didn't respond to the implied threat. Instead, she removed her phone from her purse and placed it deliberately in the center of the metal table. The officers watched with poorly concealed disdain as she pressed a few buttons, then set it to speakerphone mode. The call connected after 2 rings. "James Chen," answered a crisp male voice. "James, this is Victoria," she said, her voice steady, but with an unmistakable steel beneath it. "I've just been physically removed from a Skybay Airlines flight after multiple instances of discrimination." There was a momentary silence on the other end of the line, then an explosion of concern. "What? Are you all right? Do you need legal?" Victoria cut him off, her focus absolute. "What I need is for you to execute Plan B. The $5.2 billion contract is canceled, effective immediately. Move everything to Continental." The security officers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the tearful call to a husband or friend they had expected. And that number, $5.2 billion, hung in the air like a suddenly visible threat. James's voice came through the speaker again, measured but with an undercurrent of shock. "Victoria, that's their lifeline contract. Their stock will collapse." "I'm aware," Victoria interrupted again, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Do it now. Full press release within the hour. Make it crystal clear exactly why this is happening." The shorter officer shifted his weight nervously, his eyes now fixed on the phone, as the magnitude of what he was hearing began to register. "Yes, ma'am," James replied, all hesitation gone from his voice, replaced with a crisp efficiency. "It's already being processed. The Continental representatives have been on standby since your earlier texts. They're prepared to meet immediately." "Good," Victoria said. "And James?" "Yes?" "Make sure the press release includes specific details. I want every passenger, every investor, and every competitor to understand exactly what cost Skybay this contract." "Understood. The legal team is already drafting it based on the videos." "The videos are everywhere," Chen said. "Passengers from the flight uploaded them before the plane even left Charlotte. You're trending on 3 platforms. #Skybay Shame is the top hashtag in the country right now." The taller officer's face had drained of color, his earlier smirk replaced by a dawning horror. "Excellent," Victoria replied simply. "Have Marcus bring the car to Charlotte. I'll be meeting with Continental within the hour." "He's already en route," James confirmed. "Victoria, are you safe? Do you need anything else?" Victoria looked directly at the 2 security officers as she answered. "I'm fine, James. I believe these gentlemen are about to become extraordinarily accommodating." She ended the call and returned the phone to her purse with the same unhurried dignity she had maintained throughout this ordeal. Then she looked up at the officers, meeting their now anxious gazes directly. "I suggest you contact your superiors immediately. That's if you still have your jobs." The silence that followed was deafening. The shorter officer reached for his radio with unsteady hands. The taller one, who had made the racist comment in the jetway, stood frozen, the full implications of what he had just witnessed crashing over him in devastating waves. "Ma'am," he finally managed, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension, "who exactly are you?" Victoria reached into her purse once more, extracted a business card, and placed it on the metal table between them. The cream-colored card was elegant in its simplicity, bearing only her name, title, and company logo. But in the context of what they had just heard, it might as well have been a declaration of war. The person who should award Skybay Airlines $5.2 billion. The officers stared at the card in stunned silence, the enormity of their mistake impossible to comprehend in its entirety. This wasn't just a case of misidentification or excessive force or discriminatory treatment, though it was certainly all of those things. This was a catastrophic error with financial repercussions that would echo through an entire industry. The officers released her immediately. Meanwhile, 1,200 miles away in the executive boardroom of Skybay Airlines' New York headquarters, chaos had erupted. "What do you mean GTS pulled out?" CEO Richard Harmon shouted, his face flushed with disbelief. "The contract signing is tomorrow. We've been working on this deal for 8 months. The chief communications officer stood ashen-faced at the end of the table, her tablet shaking slightly in her hands. "Sir, Global Transit Solutions has just issued a press release formally terminating all contract negotiations, effective immediately. They've announced they're moving their entire corporate travel program to Continental Airlines." "That's not possible," Harmon insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "No company pivots a $5 billion contract overnight without warning. There must be some mistake." "Sir," the CCO continued, her voice barely steady, "they cited systemic discriminatory treatment of their CEO Victoria King on Skybay Airlines Flight 3429 this morning." "Victoria King?" Harmon repeated, the blood draining from his face. "Victoria King was on our flight?" The chief operating officer swiveled his laptop toward Harmon. "You need to see this." On the screen, a series of videos played in succession. Victoria being questioned at the first-class check-in, Victoria being confronted about her seat assignment, Victoria being forcibly removed from the aircraft, Victoria being dragged through the terminal while a security officer made a racist comment. Each clip more damning than the last, each spreading exponentially across social media platforms. "Oh my God," Harmon whispered. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Sir," the CFO interjected, pointing to the wall of digital displays, "our stock has gone down." "Get her on the phone," Harmon ordered, his voice cracking. "Get me Victoria King right now." "We've tried, sir," the CCO replied. "Her office says she's unavailable. They directed us to their press release and their legal department." "Then find out where she is," Harmon shouted, desperation overtaking decorum. "Send a car, send a plane, send whatever it takes." The COO looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. "Sir, according to social media reports, she's already en route to Continental Airlines headquarters in Atlanta." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. It wasn't just the loss of the contract, catastrophic as that was. It was the knowledge that their competitor would now secure the very lifeline Skybay had been counting on. Back in Charlotte, Victoria King stepped into the black Mercedes that had arrived at the terminal's VIP exit. As the door closed behind her, sealing her in the vehicle's climate-controlled quiet, she allowed herself, for the first time since this ordeal began, a moment of genuine emotional response. A single deep breath that carried with it the weight of the morning's accumulated indignities. As the Mercedes merged onto the highway toward Atlanta, Victoria's phone chimed with a notification. She glanced down to see a breaking news alert displayed on the screen. Breaking. Global Transit Solutions terminates $5 billion Skybay Airlines contract. The headline was accompanied by a stock ticker showing Skybay shares in free fall, already down 27% and continuing to decline as the market absorbed the implications of losing their last hope for financial stability. Continental Airlines' headquarters in Atlanta stood as a gleaming testament to corporate success, 42 stories of glass and steel rising above the city skyline. As Victoria King's Mercedes pulled into the private executive entrance, a welcome committee had already assembled. The Continental CEO himself, Thomas Reeves, waited at the door alongside his executive leadership team, their expressions a carefully composed blend of professional courtesy and barely contained excitement. This was not a scheduled meeting. There had been no time for the usual corporate formalities, the calendar invitations, the agenda preparations, the briefing documents. Yet every decision-maker who mattered at Continental Airlines had dropped everything to be present for this unprecedented opportunity. "Miss King," Thomas Reeves stepped forward, extending his hand. "We're deeply disturbed by what happened to you this morning. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Victoria accepted his handshake with a measured nod. "I appreciate your flexibility, Mr. Reeves." As Continental's executive team escorted Victoria toward the elevators, her phone continued to vibrate in her purse. Call after call from Skybay Airlines being systematically ignored. Richard Harmon, Skybay's CEO, had now called 17 times in the past 30 minutes, his messages growing increasingly desperate as the financial implications of the morning's events became devastatingly clear. But Victoria's executive team was executing her contingency protocols flawlessly. Her assistant deflected Harmon's calls with practiced diplomacy. "I'm sorry, Ms. King is in meetings all day. I'd be happy to connect you with our legal department." Meanwhile, James Chen, her executive VP, was coordinating with Continental's team, ensuring they understood exactly what was at stake and what would be required to secure Global Transit Solutions business. Victoria flashed back to 3 months ago when she flew Continental in simple clothing with no one knowing who she was, and she was treated well like a queen, so they deserved the contract next after Skybay. 1,200 miles away in New York, Skybay Airlines headquarters had transformed into a crisis center. The boardroom that had been preparing to celebrate a contract signing was now the site of an emergency meeting that would determine whether the company survived at all. "Our stock has dropped 63% and is still falling," the CFO reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Trading may be halted if it continues at this rate." Richard Harmon paced the length of the mahogany table, his earlier confidence shattered. "She's not returning my calls. Her office won't put me through. I've sent messages through every channel we have." "Sir," the chief strategy officer interjected, "we need to address the immediate financial implications. Without the GTS contract, we will go fully bankrupt." "I know what happens without the GTS contract," Harmon snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "We were counting on that cash infusion to restructure our debt. Without it, we have maybe 60 days before we default on our loans." The revelation hung in the air. The brutal truth they had been carefully concealing from shareholders in the market for months. Skybay Airlines had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, the Global Transit Solutions contract their last hope for salvation. Now that hope had evaporated in the space of a single morning, all because their staff couldn't recognize a black woman might legitimately belong in first class. The Skybay Airlines board meeting had deteriorated further as the financial reality became increasingly dire. Richard Harmon had stopped pacing, now slumped in his chair at the head of the table. "How did no one recognize her?" he asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Victoria King is one of the most powerful CEOs in transportation. How did our staff not know who she was? The question revealed the fundamental flaw in his thinking, the assumption that respectful treatment should depend on recognizing someone's status rather than being the standard for all passengers. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, entering the boardroom with visible trepidation. "Miss King's office just sent over a press release they're distributing in 10 minutes. They thought you should see it first." She handed him a tablet displaying the document. As Harmon read it, what little color remained drained from his face. "They're detailing everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "The check-in discrimination, the seat verification, the security removal. They have passenger testimonials, video timestamps, officer names." He looked up at his executive team, the full weight of the catastrophe finally sinking in. They even have a quote from the security officer, the racial comment about first class being too good for some people. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. They weren't just losing a contract, they were becoming a case study in corporate failure, a cautionary tale that would be taught in business schools for decades to come. In Atlanta, Victoria King stood at the head of the Continental boardroom table, watching as Thomas Reeves signed the contract. Each executive had added their signature, committing the airline to the most progressive passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies in the industry. "Congratulations, Mr. Reeves," Victoria said as he signed the final page. "You've just secured the largest corporate travel contract in aviation history. By this time tomorrow, every corporate travel manager in America will know that Continental Airlines has set a new benchmark for passenger dignity and respect." The implications weren't lost on anyone in the room. What had begun as an opportunistic windfall was being transformed into a strategic repositioning of Continental's entire brand identity, with Victoria King's experience as the catalyst. As the meeting concluded and handshakes were exchanged, Thomas Reeves pulled Victoria aside. "I have to ask," he said quietly, "was this all part of some plan? Did you choose to fly Skybay knowing something like this might happen?" Victoria met his gaze directly. "Mr. Reeves, no one chooses humiliation as a strategy. What happened today was entirely Skybay's doing. How it ends, however, is my choice." She gestured to the signed contract on the table. "And yours. What matters now is whether this moment becomes merely an anecdote about corporate comeuppance or the beginning of genuine change in how airlines see and treat their passengers. All their passengers." Before he could respond, Victoria's phone chimed with a notification. She glanced down to see a news alert. Skybay Airlines stock halted after 70% drop, bankruptcy rumors swirling. As Victoria prepared to depart the Continental headquarters, James Chen approached with another update. "The press release is going out now," he informed her. "And we've received requests for interviews from every major business publication and network." Victoria nodded, considering her next move carefully. The story of what had happened on that Skybay flight was already spreading uncontrollably across social media, shaped by passenger videos and outraged commentary. But the full narrative, the $5 billion consequences of that discrimination, was hers to define. The next morning, a story that had transcended business news to become a national conversation. Every major network led with the same footage. Victoria King being dragged from a Skybay Airlines flight, followed by the staggering financial consequences that had resulted. Skybay Airlines hastily called a press conference where a visibly shaken Richard Harmon delivered what crisis management experts would later describe as too little, too late. "On behalf of Skybay Airlines, I want to offer our deepest and most sincere apologies to Ms. Victoria King for the inexcusable treatment she experienced on our flight yesterday," Harmon began, his voice strained under the weight of the company's collapsing stock price. "What happened was a complete failure of our values and training. It does not represent who we are or who we aspire to be as a company. But the market had already rendered its verdict. With trading of Skybay stock resumed, shares continued their free fall, having lost nearly 80% of their value in less than 24 hours. Financial analysts were openly discussing bankruptcy scenarios on business networks, with one commentator noting, "This isn't just a PR disaster, it's an existential threat." Skybay needed that contract to survive. By midday, Skybay announced the termination of all staff involved in the incident: the check-in agent, the flight attendants, the purser, and the security officers who had removed Victoria from the aircraft. But the damage control didn't stop there. By evening, the company's board of directors released a statement announcing Richard Harmon's resignation, effective immediately. "Leadership must be accountable," the statement read. "The failures that led to yesterday's events reflect system-wide issues that require new vision and direction." Meanwhile, at her own press conference, Victoria King stood not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a business leader demanding accountability. The event wasn't held at her company headquarters, but at a historically Black university's business school, where hundreds of students had gathered to hear her speak. "What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident," Victoria explained, her voice steady and measured. "It was the visible manifestation of biases that affect thousands of travelers every day across every airline. The difference is that most passengers can't respond by canceling a $5 billion contract." She detailed the systematic issues she had observed, from the check-in discrimination to the repeated questioning of her first-class status, from the security screening disparities to the physical removal from a seat she had legitimately purchased. "These weren't random acts of rudeness," she continued. "They were consistent expressions of the same underlying assumption, that a Black woman couldn't possibly belong in first class unless there was some mistake. That assumption cost Skybay Airlines everything, but its real cost is paid daily by passengers who don't have the platform or power to make their experiences matter to corporate bottom lines." As Victoria spoke, the camera occasionally cut to the audience of business students, many of whom were taking notes with intense focus, understanding they were witnessing not just a news story, but a master class in corporate accountability and leadership. 6 months later, Victoria King boarded a Continental Airlines flight from New York to Paris. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, the agent greeted her by name before she had even presented her ID. "Good morning, Miss King. Continental Airlines is honored to have you with us today." There was no questioning of her ticket, no scrutiny of her documentation, no surprised looks or microaggressions, just efficient, professional service delivered with genuine respect. If anything, the staff seemed almost nervous in their determination to ensure everything was perfect. As Victoria made her way through security, she noted the new signage prominently displayed throughout the terminal. "Every passenger deserves dignity and respect. If you experience or witness differential treatment, please contact our passenger advocacy team." The signs included a QR code linking directly to a reporting system that had been implemented as part of the contract she had signed with Continental. The changes weren't limited to Continental Airlines. In the wake of Skybay's very public implosion, carriers across the industry had scrambled to review and revise their own policies and training procedures. The hashtag "Respect is the minimum" had evolved from a viral moment into an industry-wide movement, with passengers using it to document both positive and negative experiences. Industry publications reported that complaints of discriminatory treatment had declined 47% across major airlines in the 6 months following what was now commonly referred to as the Skybay incident. Whether driven by genuine ethical concerns or simple fear of becoming the next cautionary tale, airlines had finally begun treating passenger dignity as a business priority rather than a public relations consideration. Victoria settled into her first-class seat, observing the cabin crew's interactions with all passengers. Noting the consistency of their service across racial and gender lines, the absence of the subtle differences in tone and attention she had documented throughout her career. As for Skybay Airlines, its fate had been sealed that day in Charlotte. 3 weeks after losing the Global Transit Solutions contract, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 2 months later, its assets were acquired by a competitor at pennies on the dollar. The Skybay name retired permanently from the skies, a costly footnote in aviation history. The security officers who had removed Victoria from Flight 3429 found themselves not only terminated but essentially unhireable within the aviation industry. The man who had made the racist comment about first class being too good for some people was last seen working at an electronics store in suburban Charlotte. His career in security ended by a single sentence captured on a passenger's phone. But Victoria hadn't spent these months focused on Skybay's demise or individual comeuppance. Instead, she had channeled the attention generated by the incident into creating lasting change. Global Transit Solutions had established a mentorship program for young Black women in business leadership, with Victoria personally mentoring 5 promising executives each year. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe and like button and share to others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.